Good morning, everyone. I'm Gary Seymour, Director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. I'd like to welcome all of you to a special Crown seminar on the fallout from the Israeli-Hamas war with Ambassador Dan Kurtzer. Before I introduce our two participants, I want to remind everybody the seminar is being recorded and we'll post the event on our YouTube channel and on the events tab on the Crown Center website. If you have any questions for the speakers during this event, please post them in the Q&A section. We're going to begin today's event with a 10-minute overview from Ambassador Kurtzer. That'll be followed by about a 30-minute discussion with Shai Feldman. And then we'll take questions from you, from the audience, for about 30 minutes, and we'll end promptly at 12:15. So with that, let me introduce our two speakers. We're very fortunate to welcome Ambassador Kurtzer, who's the Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. During Ambassador Kurtzer's long career in the State Department, he was deeply involved in efforts to promote peace between Israel and Palestine and between Israel and its neighbors. And Ambassador Kurtzer served as a U.S. ambassador to both Israel and Egypt. I believe only the second U.S. diplomat to hold both posts. He's also written extensively about the Middle East. In conversation with Ambassador Kurtzer will be Shai Feldman, the Raymond Frankel Professor in Israeli Politics and Society and founding director of the Crown Center. And I also want to mention Shai is the co-author, along with Khalil Shikaki and Abdulmonem Saeed Ali, of a textbook, Arabs and Israelis, Conflict and Peacemaking in the Middle East, which the second edition of which was just published in 2022. And given the events since October 7, I'm sure they're going to be working on a third edition. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Shai and to Ambassador Kurtzer.
I think, Dan, you're first.
Okay. Gary, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to the Crown Center and for that introduction. I want to start with a paraphrase of something written by Lewis Carroll, where he said, if you don't know where you're going, any path will take you there. We're in a situation with Israel and Hamas where if they don't know where they're going, they're not sure they're going to get to where they think they want to go. Hamas clearly has an objective in this war of survival. Israel's objectives are a little bit less clear. Prime Minister Netanyahu has articulated a goal of destroying Hamas, which most people believe is not achievable. But he has been unwilling thus far to think out loud very much about the day after. And that's where the rest of us have spent a great deal of time, including the American administration. So I want to spend a few minutes thinking about the day after as a possible outcome or set of outcomes that would at least end the war and lead to something different from what we've seen in the past 5 wars between Israel and Hamas since 2006. There are at least 2 levels of analysis to think about. One is the kind of immediate question of how do you reconstruct Gaza and reconstitute society in Gaza following the massive destruction that's been wrought by the Israeli bombing and ground campaign. We saw how difficult that was after the war in 2014. It took a number of years and hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to get to a point where we were almost back to where we had been before the 2014 war. So issue number one on the day after is a a very practical and functional question. Issue number two in the day after is, well, who governs in Gaza, both in the immediate term and in the longer term? For some period of time, Israel is certainly likely to remain in Gaza, perhaps in stripped down fashion. But whether or not Israel tries to maintain a longer term security presence, at least in the short term, there will be Israeli forces maintaining a presence in order to deny Hamas the ability to come out of the tunnels and reconstitute itself. If that's the case, who maintains law and order the day after? Who does the basic kinds of governing that needs to be done, the provision of basic services? Who provides security, both from Hamas and from Israel, for the people of civilians of Gaza? And how quickly can their humanitarian situation be addressed and rectified? At the same time, an additional challenge is on the other side of the border. Several 100,000 Israelis have been evacuated from their homes, the homes having been destroyed on October 7th, their communities having been destroyed. And the question for the state of Israel is how fast those communities can be reconstituted so as to assure the people who live there that they won't face the kind of horror that they experienced on October 7th. Now, if that were the only thing that we needed to look at in this day after scenario, it would be extraordinarily challenging, extraordinarily difficult to implement, very, very expensive, politically sensitive, and it would raise very serious questions about security and governance. But if that's the only thing we're looking at, then I believe we would be fating ourselves to see this happen again in the future. Whether Hamas or Hamas 2.0 or some successor to Hamas that would emerge from the rubble and continue the resistance against Israel in the violent way that we saw happened on October 7th. So how do you do what needs to be done just to get life back to where it was, both in the Israeli communities on the Israeli side of the Gaza line and within Gaza itself? And I think one of the key issues that has now been raised by President Biden, but we've seen pushback already from Israel, from the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu, is the need to address the underlying Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, for many of you on this call, this will evoke memories of the long-term effort to bring about a two-state solution. Negotiations that were launched at Madrid in 1991, accelerated by the Oslo Accords in 1993, and then the various efforts, both in the 90s, then at Camp David, and then the efforts of Prime Minister Olmert and President Mahmoud Abbas, the Obama administration. In other words, there's been a long and challenging path to try to bring about progress toward a two-state solution. But the argument I think that some of us are making now is that if we don't return to an active pursuit and a serious pursuit of a solution to the underlying problem, we're going to see a recurrence of what happened on October 7th in some form or another for many years to come. As we know, before October 7th, the policy of the Israeli government was described by some as mowing the lawn. In other words, dealing with issues as they emerged based on incursions by individuals or groups from Gaza, individual acts of terrorism. And the Netanyahu government from 2009 until before October 7th basically felt that that was a price that Israel was prepared to pay rather than having to deal with the underlying political issues that the peace process would entail. And that's now going to be the big challenge for this pathway forward. And it gets us to what I hope will be the discussion that Shai and I will have as to what would constitute a serious effort towards peace. It can't simply be the rhetoric that we've heard over the past 25 years that we support a two-state solution. We support the idea of two states living side by side in peace and security. In other words, the rhetoric that peace processors have used over these couple of decades will simply not be sufficient in order to move forward on that level of analysis. And unless that level of activity is more serious, I make the argument that we will not even be able to make serious progress on reconstituting life in Gaza or in the Israeli communities. In other words, we need what I would argue is a two-tiered process moving forward on the day after. Tier one involves all of those activities that I mentioned at the outset and more. How do you bring the international community and the Arab world on board a very tenuous and tentative process? But there has to be a second tier happening simultaneously, and that has to be led by the United States. By process of elimination, there still is no other player on the international or regional scene that can mobilize and activate a serious peace process. But I underline the word serious. For the United States to return to a more laissez-faire approach that we pursued since the mid-1990s will not work. But we have to actually launch something quite more ambitious, including demands on both Israel and the Palestinians to change their behaviors, to change the activities in which they've engaged that have undercut and undermined the prospects of peace, to reverse those activities, and to move forward in parallel with what we're doing in Gaza. So Shai, why don't I stop there and look forward to our discussion.
Great. Thank you, Dan. That was an excellent entree into this discussion. And what I'm going to do is just ask you 4 or 5 questions that will give you an opportunity to dive even deeper into the issues that you raised. To some measures, I've been inspired by the piece that you published with Aaron Miller, which was excellent, and also by the piece that you published with Steve Simon. Both of them are excellent, and I recommend everybody that's listening to us to read these 2 pieces. But I'll focus mostly on a few issues that were raised by the piece you published with Aaron Miller. So my first question is this. In the piece, you wrote, and I quote, "The Biden administration must undertake bold policy moves, ones that firmly guide the region towards a two-state solution. Bold American leadership will now support a good outcome in the future." And I read what you're saying as basically that under right circumstances and everybody doing what they should be doing, a two-state solution is still possible or is not impossible. So my question is this: how do you respond to those who say that the days in which this was the case are long over, that the depth of Israeli occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as other trajectories that make the current slide towards a one-state reality irreversible, make the implementation of a two-state solution no longer possible? I think this is the central argument that our colleague Ian Lustig has raised, and I wonder what's your response to this counter argument? It says, so this is long gone.
Well, with respect to the really excellent analysts and friends who have written now extensively on both the one-state reality and what some of them are calling the one-state solution, the fact is that while the reality on the ground may make it extremely difficult to realize a two-state solution, I don't see an alternative. In fact, several years ago, I asked my graduate students at Princeton to come up with an alternative to the two-state solution. And they said to me at the beginning of that semester that they intended to prove that the two-state solution was not the only possible solution. And after a semester of hard work by very smart graduate students, they reluctantly concluded that the only possible outcome, which would not assure eternal war and eternal conflict, would be the separation of Israelis and Palestinians into two entities in which both can achieve self-determination and independence and sovereignty, and then can decide later how they interact with each other. Now, in terms of the difficulty of getting there and the challenges on the ground, I would argue, first of all, that we have a classic case of the necessity of leadership. I'm not naive enough to believe that leaders alone can move mountains or can change long-held beliefs. But without leadership, no matter how enticing policies may look or theories may suggest, nothing will happen. And right now, we don't have that leadership in the region, either in Israel on the part of Prime Minister Netanyahu, or in Palestine on the part of President Mahmoud Abbas. And therefore, if there's going to be any leadership trying to get us back on track to a two-state outcome, it'll have to come from the outside. And that's why I mentioned earlier that I think that the United States, President of the United States, needs to stand up and take leadership here. But the second issue is, are the substantive differences or substantive challenges between Israelis and Palestinians amenable to resolution? And they all are. There's a resolution to the Jerusalem issue, which in some respects may be the most challenging. Some years ago, a group of former diplomats in Canada started a project called the Jerusalem Old City Initiative. I participated in that, and they came up with very creative ideas, some of which were actually brought to the negotiating table by Prime Minister Olmert in 2008, because they were creative enough to at least try. The question of refugees, which has been vexing, is also resolvable, with discussions having begun some years ago in Taba in 2001. The parties can find a way of reducing the refugee issue to manageable proportions. And the third issue, which essentially is the territorial issue, has been the most discussed among the parties, and they've made the most progress, including on this question of equal swaps. Israel would retain some of the settlement blocks and hand over an equivalent amount of territory, both in quality and quantity, from Israel proper. That leaves the kind of the biggest final question, which is, well, what do you do with the 400,000 or 500,000 settlers and the several hundred settlements that Israel has established over the years? Shaul Arieli, a retired colonel in the Israeli army, has devoted several decades now to analyzing this question, and has concluded that it doesn't loom as large as it appears. Because if you start to deconstruct the settlements movement, you have those settlements that are on the so-called Green Line that would remain in Israel under swaps. You have those settlements that are populated by the commuters who are looking for a better life, clean air, swimming pools, who, if their property values were assured by a government buyout, would follow government policy. And when you start to strip away these numbers, you're left with a very hard core of extreme settlers that probably number in the 75 to 80,000 figure. I don't minimize the difficulty of dealing with that, but this is not an impossible problem to resolve, both with incentives and disincentives and a committed Israeli leadership. You have on the other side, on the Palestinian side, equal challenges. This is not simply a matter of Israel having to make decisions, but are Palestinians really willing to accept what's now being called 1967 as opposed to 1948? In other words, are they willing to accept a state in 22% of Palestine, as opposed to relitigating the question of whether or not a Palestinian state should be larger than 22%. Are they prepared to consider some concessions with regard to refugees, that not all refugees will have the ability to exercise a right to return to their homes in Palestine? And are they willing to accept a creative formula in Jerusalem, particularly in the Old City? So when you start to deconstruct or disaggregate these issues, Shai, it's not as daunting a problem as some of the one-staters, whether the one-state reality advocates or the one-state solution advocates tend to suggest. Final note, I haven't seen any polling, and you would know better than I, given your partnership with Khalil Shikaki, who's the best pollster in Palestine. I've seen no polling either in Palestine or in Israel to suggest that either side really wants a one-state solution. For Israel, a one-state solution would essentially be an end of Zionism as an ideology, and it could call into question either the Jewish and or democratic nature of the state. And for Palestine to emerge in a one-state reality, given the strength of Israeli society and military and its history, would almost assure Palestinians a secondary role. And so therefore, the two sides don't want it. And I don't understand why there is now this focus on something that nobody wants because it's so hard to get to the alternative.
Great. So my second question will have us dive into the day after. You know that Israel, I know you know that Israel's prime minister, most, if not all members of the current governing coalition in Israel, are opposed to giving the PA an important role in governing the Gaza Strip in the war's aftermath. There have been a number of American statements about a new and improved PA. And so my question is, what if the Israeli leaders change their approach or their attitude about this issue, which I think is central, the role of the PA in the day after? In your view, can the PA be part of the solution? And if so, what needs to happen and what kind of transformation does the PA need to undergo in order to become part of the solution? And what are the odds, even under the best of circumstances, that the PA can implement such a reinvention?
Let me start with the end. The odds are long. It will not be easy to persuade, encourage, challenge the current PLO and PA leadership to undergo the kind of reforms and revitalization that not just the United States, but most other players in the international community believe is necessary. The PA is not popular. It doesn't function very well outside of the Muqata, its headquarters in Ramallah. It's seen by so many Palestinians as a surrogate of the Israeli occupation, especially PA security forces. And so thinking about the PA taking over governance in Gaza today is not realistic. And that's why the calls have been for the PA to undergo reform. The problem is that what stimulates the reform? Because you have two societies now where change in leadership is very difficult to forecast. In Israel, how do you move a government out of office when it's intent upon staying in office until the next election? And in the Palestinian Authority, there aren't any elections, and therefore there isn't a mechanism to bring about a question of a mandate for new leadership. And here's where I think we need a multilateral focus. It's not something that any one country like the United States can do, but tremendous pressure needs to be brought to bear on the PA leadership, Mahmoud Abbas and others, to start down this path of a successor regime. A few years ago, you recall, Shai, that Hussein Agha and Ahmed Khalidi wrote an article in Foreign Affairs basically saying it was the end of Palestinian nationalism as we knew it. I called them at the time and said, I'm waiting for your next article, which is, how do you reconstitute the Palestinian national institutional structure? And that's where we are today. It's going to be a bit of a long haul. I think during this period of between the day after and a period in which Israel may feel secure enough to withdraw from Gaza, which is not certain, but may feel secure enough, there may be time for this kind of pressure to be brought to bear on the Palestinian Authority and the PLO to undergo reform. One last point, before October 7th, some of us were quite concerned and writing about the possibility of a third intifada in the West Bank because of what was happening in Jenin and Nablus with young, disaffected nationalist youth who were not Hamas, but they were fed up with the failure of the peace process and the failure of resistance, which means that in some ways we're looking at a recurrence of what we saw in the first intifada, where people in the occupied territories, fed up with the PLO's ability to move things forward, kind of took things on their own shoulders and moved things forward. And one of the questions then for outsiders is, how do we help, quote unquote, civil society in Palestine to gain a voice in this reform and revitalization process? I don't have an answer to it, Shai, but that's the critical element to get the PA ready to go back into Gaza after a number of months of interim governance.
Okay, I'll move to the third one. And that's it's not a short question. So your answer might be equally long. And this is really inspired specifically by the final paragraph of your foreign affairs piece. After listing some of the conditions that would have to be met in order to for a positive outcome of the war to materialize, you write, and I quote, and this is the time where some of the listeners, at least after the end of this paragraph, will reach for some antidepressant. And the quote is, can any of this succeed with the current Israeli and Palestinian leadership at the helm? Not a chance. Netanyahu must go, and Abbas too. But even if they stay in power in the near term, the United States has stronger options. Biden must not threaten to withhold necessary military assistance from Israel, but he can make it clear to Israelis that the continued strength of their relationship with Washington rests on Israeli understanding that it cannot occupy Gaza. By framing his rhetoric as the kind of straight talk that Netanyahu avoids, Biden may be able to influence Israeli attitudes without diminishing his chances of re-election in 2024. And I end the quote. So I'll play the devil's advocate and argue that a different rhetoric won't do the trick. Netanyahu is a master of not hearing what he doesn't want to hear. And Israeli leaders have heeded only when US presidents utilized real leverage and put blunt pressure on Israel. President Eisenhower in coercing Ben-Gurion to agree to an Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai after the Suez War. President Nixon and Henry Kissinger in coercing Prime Minister Rabin to accept the terms of a second disengagement with Egypt. And President H.W. Bush and Jim Baker in coercing Shamir to show up in Madrid by threatening to withhold the $10 million of loan guarantee. So my question is, and in all these cases, by the way, American leverage and pressure worked. So what are the grounds, under what grounds can we assume that a change in US rhetoric and a US rhetoric that won't diminish Biden's chances of getting re-election would be enough to do the trick?
So first of all, I agree with you, and that's why I wrote the last paragraph. But in a sense, the response to that last paragraph was in a piece that I wrote in The Atlantic, which laid out this two-tiered approach to both reconstructing Gaza and revitalizing a peace process. The underlying argument has to be, or the underlying question, it really is, whether Joe Biden can be, wants to be, intends to be a transformational president. If, because of electoral reasons or his own hesitancy to put the kind of pressure on Israel that needs to be imposed, if he decides to confine his arguments with Netanyahu to rhetoric, and we see even now that some of that rhetoric is getting stronger, but not having any particular impact, then yes, let's reach for the antidepressants, because we're in for much more of the same, both in terms of this war and future wars. But the challenge that some of us have laid out for the president is to look beyond both transactional politics and electoral politics, and to decide to be transformational. Now, it would be easier if he were a second-term president, because he wouldn't face this question of being caught between progressives within his own party and moderates within his party, Republicans ready to pounce, uncommitted voters in Michigan and elsewhere. But he doesn't enjoy that luxury. The reality is he's still a first-term president. He's probably looking at two other first-term presidents who tried to be transformational and ended up as only one-term presidents, Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush, both of whom were not reelected for a lot of other reasons, but part of their concern, part of the concerns of some part of the electorate in both cases was their policy toward Israel and the perception that they were coming down too hard on Israel. So Bush has a hard choice to make. But if he doesn't make the choice, he will be leaving behind.
You mean Biden? You mean Biden has a hard choice to make?
Yeah. What did I say?
Bush.
Yeah. You know, there's an expression, halavai, we only wish it was George H.W. Bush. Biden has a very hard choice to make because it is caught between policy and politics. Now, when we talk about what needs to get done and which needs to go beyond rhetoric, and I fully agree, there's a large menu of ways in which we can influence both the Israeli government and the Israeli public. And you really have to think about both looking ahead. Influencing the Israeli government, you go down the menu of pressures. I made the case, Aaron and I made the case not to immediately cut off or to diminish military aid because that cuts to the heart of security. And it would give Netanyahu too easy an argument to make that we are jeopardizing the security of the state. But there's the quality of our relationship. We have dozens upon dozens of bilateral programs which can be halted or frozen. We have the ability to curb high-level visits, as we've done with Netanyahu since the constitution of the new Israeli government anyway. He has not been invited to the White House, and it irks him that he has not been invited to the White House. So you can go down a very long list of issues before you get to a military cutoff, where the squeeze is put on the Israeli government in a manner that they have to pay attention. But there's a second track, and that is to influence the Israeli public. Today, I think it would probably be fair to say that the public is still in a trauma situation, probably has moved to the right politically because of the trauma, but they also haven't been faced with a hard choice. And one of the things that the President of the United States can do in coordination with European leaders and with Arab leaders, Saudi, Emirati, Egyptian, Jordanian, is to put a stark choice before the Israeli people. You know, it's my way or the highway. You want the United States to be with you. We're going to have to do some hard work and make some tough choices on issues related to peace and on issues related to the occupation. If you make a choice otherwise, bringing Netanyahu back to power or bringing his coalition back to power, even if he leaves, then the United States will have to rethink the nature of its relationship with Israel, because you'll be heading in a direction with which we don't agree. So it's a choice for the president. It's going to be a choice that I hope he imposes on the people of Israel, and a choice I hope he imposes on the government of Israel as well.
Yeah, I'll put a little devil's advocate star here, which is since there aren't that menu of projects between the United States and the Palestinian side, then almost by definition, not by will, but by definition, because of this asymmetry, much of this pressure is going to look one-sided, because the US has leverage on Israel. It has practically no leverage on the Palestinians. If you look at the realities in the last few weeks, as far as the negotiations regarding the hostage issue, even countries like Qatar and Egypt seem to not have the leverage to press Hamas in the direction that they would like Hamas to take. So how are you going to respond to this asymmetry?
Well, there's two different issues. They end up being related, but they're separable. One is, as you noted in your last comment, is the asymmetry argument. The fact of the matter is, Israel is an occupying power and has virtual total control over every aspect of Palestinian life. There are two issues where pressure can and should be put on the Palestinian Authority. One relates to the degree to which they pursue counterterrorism and counterviolence activities within the West Bank through the Palestine Security Forces. And the other is what has been called incitement, which includes, for example, the continued payments by the Palestinian Authority to the families of those who have engaged in terrorism. So there are at least two issues. There may be others where pressure can be brought on the Palestinian Authority, on the PLO. But the reality is that we are in an asymmetrical situation in which the Palestinians, in a sense, don't have that much to do other than to agree at the end of the day to a two-state solution, whereas Israel has tough choices to make, whether or not to continue to occupy and control the West Bank and East Jerusalem, or whether to begin a process that would divest Israel of the occupation. So I don't want to pretend that the pressures will be equal, but I also think it's important that the incentives are also not equal. What we provide to Israel, the United States provides to Israel, is so measurably more significant than what the United States provides to Palestinians, that you have an imbalance there as well, an imbalance in pressures and also an imbalance in incentives. And that's just the nature of the beast of this peace process.
Good. Dan, I want to ask you a question that we try to kind of mine your particular perspective as a former ambassador in Egypt, and help me deal with the following puzzle. The Egyptians are very well aware, and repeat this again and again and again, that Hamas historically is basically an offspring of the Muslim Brothers, that it is the renamed Palestinian Muslim Brothers. They have a particular narrative that I'm sure you're aware of a role that they ascribe to Hamas in the Arab Spring. They argue that Hamas guys infiltrated from Gaza to Egypt and played a role in opening up some of the prisons and releasing the prisoners who were in Egyptian prisons and so on. So there's a big essentially narrative, anti-Hamas narrative in Egypt. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, you know, when you look at the sheer quantities of weapons and ammunition and everything that the IDF uncovers in Khan Yunis and other areas of the Gaza Strip, it's nearly impossible to believe that those quantities of weapons and ammunition have reached there either through the sea, where the Israeli Navy is patrolling, or through the air, since they don't really have a transport air force. They must have come from the ground. And then the question is, how does this mesh? It looks like Sisi is said to have dealt with this, with essentially ending the story of the smuggling tunnels, and yet these tons and tons of stuff has found its way to Gaza. What's your reading here?
You know, on the positive side, we sometimes say to our friends that it's important to have two contradictory thoughts in your mind at the same time, because both of them have validity in some respects. And here we have a kind of negative side of that. The Egyptians, like others, Qatar, for example, pursues policies that are not necessarily as consistent as we might want to think they should be. And so the Egyptians know that they have to maintain a relationship with all factions in Gaza, and they do that for their own national security purposes. They don't want Hamas to infiltrate Sinai and Egypt again, as happened in the past. And so there is an interest in maintaining a dialogue and a relationship. They are probably less than effective, both operationally and intentionally, with regard to the smuggling of weapons, as long as they're going from south to north, from Egypt to Gaza, and not the other way. And on the other hand, Egypt, for its own national security purposes, as has been evident since the revolution in 1952, sees the Muslim Brotherhood as a real threat to the security of the regime, sometimes a latent threat and sometimes an active threat. There was that period when Mohamed Morsi became president when some of us wondered whether the concept had changed, but the reaction in, when was it, 2015? When was the Sisi revolution, I guess? 15 or 13?
I think it was earlier, yeah.
Yeah, 13, July of 13, you know, kind of brought things back to where they were. The MB, the Muslim Brotherhood, is a threat, and its offshoot in Gaza is also a threat. You know, we see it in Qatar. Qatar is the home of Al Jazeera, as anti-American, anti-Israel, anti-West as you can imagine. Qatar hosts one of the biggest US bases outside of the United States. Qatar plays a critical role in what's now the hostage, prisoners, ceasefire, humanitarian negotiations. And Qatar is a friend of Hamas, or at least accepts Hamas as an interlocutor. So it's not an adequate explanation, but it does point to the fact that in this case, Egypt is holding on to two very contradictory policies and trying to, if not bridge them, at least deal with them simultaneously to advance its own interests. And, you know, sometimes it's more successful than others. I think the failure until now of this complex negotiation and ceasefire and so forth is primarily the situation, you know, rests on decisions by Hamas and Israel, but it also is impacted by Qatar and Egypt and their approach to these negotiations.
Okay, I'll ask one last question, which of course may take us a few minutes beyond the 30 minutes allotted to our our second part of the program. And here I'm really trying to exploit this unique combination of you being for decades part of the US government, and now for the last couple of decades, a member of something I would call the expert community. And ask you to reflect, you know, based on your extensive experience, how you see the role of the expert community in trying to make sense of the Middle East. And here's my puzzle. The magnitude of the surprise that Hamas's horrific attack on October 7 led to another wave of revisiting strategic surprises in the literature on strategic surprises, beginning with Pearl Harbor and Operation Barbarossa, with the Nazi Germany invaded Russia, and all the way to, of course, the October 6th, 1973 surprise crossing of the Suez Canal. And the surprise of October 7, in my view, was of similar scale because the attack revealed a very important change that almost no expert saw, other than the attack itself and before the attack itself. And what I'm referring to is the gradual transformation of the terror organization to something that comprised something closer to an army. People started to use in the first few weeks repeatedly the term battalions and brigades, let alone the fact that they crossed the border in 28 locations, almost simultaneously. And in some places, this was a combined arms attack. They came to Zikim from the sea, they came to other locations from the air, and yes, there was the most significant attack was from the ground, and this was missed. And so now, however, I have to balance this by saying that the history of peacemaking in the Middle East also saw tremendous surprises. Sadat's decision to travel to Israel, the Oslo Accords, regarding which you were the only senior member of the US administration that was not surprised. You were the only ones who saw this coming. But the Abraham Accords, I have to admit, surprised many, many, many people. So what is it about the Middle East that keeps us getting wrong? How is it that we're surprised again and again and again? And actually going back to the pessimism that many, many, many experts now have with respect to what Biden can achieve and could the horrific pictures, both of October 7 and its aftermath, can still lead to a positive change in the Middle East, which most experts completely dispense with as a possibility. Could we be surprised again?
The issue of outside expertise within both the academy and the think tank community goes back a long time. Edward Said, Bernard Lewis, and in a sense that almost originalist argument has set us off in a fairly negative direction, because Middle East analysts, by and large, have taken sides. And I don't mean that totally in the way it may sound, because there are a lot of very strong analytical frameworks that have been developed, but people start with ideological predispositions, and it leads them to conclusions which sometimes prove right and sometimes prove wrong. One of the most surprising elements of October 7th to me, because we know about the policy failure of Netanyahu in believing that Hamas was a better partner than the PLO. We know about the intelligence failures, and we know about the operational military failures. But what you mentioned was probably, in my view, one of the biggest surprises when I heard an interview from the reserve colonel who helped plan the Gaza barrier, the fence, who admitted some weeks ago on television that they had planned that billion-dollar barrier to deal with individual terrorism rather than what happened. And so all these failures came together in the government analytical community to contribute to this failed concept. And I think the rest of us outside of government are prone to the same mistakes. Back, you mentioned the Oslo business. At that time, in late 92 into 93, the American administration was largely focused on the prospect of a Syria-Israel deal. And therefore, what I was hearing from both Israelis and Norwegians about Oslo fell on deaf ears. And it became a quote unquote surprise when Shimon Peres and Uri Savir, I guess it was, visited Point Mugu, California, to tell Warren Christopher that they had reached an agreement. It should not have been a surprise. It was something where, had we not seen it as a surprise, we actually might have influenced the substance of Oslo to be stronger than it was. Oslo was a very weak accord, substantively, politically quite important, but there was no mention of Jerusalem, no mention of settlements, no mention of final status. It was an imbalance between what the Palestinians gained, which was recognition of the PLO, and what Israel gained, which was a weak Swiss cheese accord that launched negotiations. So, you come back to this question. Analysts are no better than some of their own predispositions some of the time. Our hope is that we can overcome those predispositions and look at things objectively, but it's hard. We see it now where these and sometimes nasty debates taking place on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so forth from otherwise sober analysts who are only listening and talking in the same echo chamber as those with whom they agree. I hope I'm not that. It's not to suggest that I'm necessarily right in my thinking or analysis, but I try to be as open as possible to all sides and to tell it like it is, even when it is sometimes hurt. But I don't have a real answer to the role of expertise if that expertise ends up being advocates rather than analysts.
Very good. I have a question from one of our colleagues. You might remember her when she was at Tel Aviv University, Professor Amy Singer. And actually, I'm going to read the two-part question. The first part reads that early in your remarks, you used the phrase, get life back to where it was. It seems impossible to consider that life in any sense, either in Israel or in Palestine, can ever be what it was. Is this an opportunity to move beyond some of the things that have been preventing a two-state solution? And I think you've partly addressed this question, but if you'd like to say a few more words about this. And the second part of this question reads as follows: at present, who can credibly be considered an honest broker for the negotiations that will have to take place in order to work constructively for a long-term resolution? Over to you.
So the comment that was quoted preceded the second part of my analysis, because what I was trying to talk to was the issue of the necessity of a parallel, two-tiered, simultaneous process. One tier was to get life back to normal in Gaza and the Israeli communities surrounding Gaza. But the argument that I made and make is that that's not possible unless there is this transformational move toward a Palestinian-Israeli final status agreement. Now, I have this view, predisposed to have this view, that Israel is a strong enough society to overcome the trauma and the failures that preceded October 7th. Palestine has a large population of educated, well-informed, strong people, doesn't have the same institutional structure as the state of Israel. And so both societies, I think, can find a way to get beyond trauma, get beyond the post-trauma, which will happen at some point, and build back better, as President Biden said during his campaign. But that's only possible if that second tier is worked on. In other words, if all we do is try to get Gaza back to where it was and the communities around Gaza back to where they were, then getting life back to where it was is not going to be sufficient. On the second question about an honest broker, as I said, I think the U.S. has to take the leadership role because I don't see an alternative. But as we tried unsuccessfully over the years, we have to build a coalition, sometimes called the Coalition of the Willing, or some contact group or focus group, quartet, a quartet plus. In other words, we need a multilateral approach that supports and encourages the United States in its leadership role. What the U.S. has always proved able to do and still can do is convene. And we do it quite well when we're intending to do it. But in convening, in this case, convening a serious peace process, it would work so much better if we actually had a lot of partners alongside of us. If the president gives the kind of transformational speech that I would like him to give, accompanied by the actions that I think he should take, well, then I would hope that Mohammed bin Salman would do the same thing, and Mohammed bin Zayed would do the same thing, and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and King Abdullah and the European leaders. And you'd have this blitz, coordinated blitz, multilateral efforts, in a sense led by the United States, but not the United States alone. At the end of the day, the word honest broker has never proved to be accurate. The U.S. has always had a much stronger relationship with Israel than we ever had with the Palestinians. And so our relationships with the parties has always been imbalanced. But when we were dedicated to the task, as we were 30 years ago, we accomplished purposes that, in a sense, it didn't matter that we weren't so much of a quote unquote honest broker. We were able to get things done anyway.
So, Dan, I'm going to ask you to dive into two specific aspects of a possible day after. The first is Hamas. We've talked about Hamas in various dimensions, but specifically here, what do you think? Where is the role, and what is the future, and what kind of part in the puzzle do you see Hamas playing in whatever scheme for the day after has a chance of succeeding? And the second specific question that one of our people attending us raised is, and it's actually something we haven't touched, is where is Jordan in this scheme? What role does Jordan have a real role? Is the issue of confederation between, originally the idea was between Israel and Palestine and Jordan, does that have some role here? How do you see the Jordanian role?
Well, the first question, the Hamas, it's a dependent variable. If the kinds of things that some of us have been outlining that are necessary to be done on a serious, ambitious, I'll use the word again, transformational peace process, if those things are not done, then willy-nilly Hamas or the son of Hamas is going to have a role, because there will be a vacuum that will be filled by resistance groups. The real question is a battle for, I don't like the term that was used in Vietnam, the battle of hearts and minds, but it really is a battle for the center of gravity within Palestinian life and Palestinian politics. If Palestinians generally believe that there is a pathway towards independence, sovereignty, end of occupation, the realization of their own rights, then I think it would be harder for Hamas to pursue the kind of resistance activities that it claims it's pursuing on behalf of the Palestinian people. If there isn't an alternative like that seen by the Palestinian people writ large, however, then as we saw after October 7th, Hamas's popularity jumped, not because people necessarily were happy about the slaughter and the massacre, but they were just happy that somebody was doing something against Israel. Maybe some were happy that it was slaughter and massacre and horror, but the larger question was, if the political process isn't working, then we Palestinians need to applaud the resistance process. So that's where the ultimate battle is going to be fought. It's in a sense the same as I was mentioning earlier on the Israeli side. If the Israeli people don't see a serious alternative that the United States and the world community support, that will be tough, but will lead to a potential end of conflict, then why not stick with the right wing? And why not stick with a kind of militarized foreign policy towards Palestinians? So that's really the Hamas's role is dependent. Nobody wants them to have a role, but not wanting them to have a role is different from assuring that there's an alternative that Palestinians will support, and if there are elections, ultimately will vote for. Look, Jordan, interestingly, has been the toughest Arab partner of Israel against Israel during this conflict, because in some ways it has not the most at stake, but certainly a lot at stake, given its own Palestinian population, and the prospect that Gaza could also spill over to the West Bank. About 6 months before October 7th, I wrote an article suggesting that we may be watching the beginnings of a third intifada in the West Bank. You remember the Lion's Den in Nablus and Jenin and the young people who had taken up arms. That keeps the King of Jordan up at night. The concern that there might be another uprising, that issues related to the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount could boil over as they did in 2021 and lead to a war that, in the view of some in the Israeli right wing, could become a pretext for the deportation of many Palestinians across the bridge into Jordan itself. I would hope in a situation, again, as I've painted in a hopefully idealistic way, but I hope it's more practical than simply idealism, that Jordan would join a multilateral coalition for a serious peace process. It is very much in Jordan's national self-interest to do so. On the question of the Confederation, the U.S. Institute of Peace has been pursuing a project on this question for some months. It's been on hold, obviously, since October 7th, but we're going to try to put together the various alternatives that are out there on Confederation. The problem with almost all of the Confederation alternatives that we've studied is that almost all of them require a two-state solution to start with, because to get to a confederation, you need a sovereign decision by two parties. And right now, you don't have two parties able to make a sovereign decision. Israel can do so, but Palestinians under occupation can't. I remember at one point, Yasser Arafat, when he was asked about confederation, said, I'm willing to do it, but give me my state for 5 minutes. The point being that it's hard to think about confederation as an initial step without thinking about a prior step in which the two sides are able to make independent decisions. So it's a very good idea, and it might inform negotiations in the future that would attach the confederation idea to the two-state solution idea, so that you kind of know where you're going, not only in the immediate aftermath of a peace treaty, but as the next step towards a confederation of two independent states.
Okay, I'm going to go back in some senses to the most important, I think, point that you've been making about what does it take for the future to be better than the present. And here I'm really just inspired by one of the persons who is part of our conversation, and the comments and question marks that he raised, and without hopefully without doing injustice to the way this was phrased, I would say that the question that we've been tackling, but there is here one more angle for us to address this, is the question of, and you've mentioned correctly, the decades in which there have been efforts to resolve this conflict, but the efforts have failed. And the question that is raised is, so why? What's the basis for us to think that somehow, again, out of this current mess, it can succeed where it failed time and time again? Now, if we for a minute borrow the analytical structure that in the textbook that Khalil Shikaki, Abdulmunim Saeed, and I published, that I believe that Gary mentioned in the beginning, we basically invite all of us in trying to understand developments in conflict and peacemaking in the Middle East to, with respect to every turning point, ask the question, what has happened in the international arena that can explain what happened? What happened in the regional arena that can explain what happened? What happened in the domestic politics of the protagonists that can explain what happened? And finally, the role of leaders. And so here I just go back to this. As far as the international arena, we are both talking mostly about the U.S. And frankly, these things that we can theoretically expect from President Biden, who I think in different ways has done remarkably, he has an international arena that's extremely demanding. First of all, the serious competition with China. Secondly, a war in the middle of Europe that, if we asked ourselves a few years ago, would we anticipate a war in the middle of Europe? Well, it's happened, and it involves from both sides a nuclear armed powers, the U.S. being one of them and Russia being the other one. So it's a very complicated international arena. I would say so complicated that I am myself surprised by what effort and how much time and energy the director of the CIA is devoting to the issue of the conflict in Gaza and the hostages and so on and so forth, given these negatives in the international arena. The region actually is the only level at which I can say it's more conducive than before. We didn't have a coalition of Arab countries where Jordan and Egypt have been joined by three significant Abraham Accords players, and a Saudi Arabia that plays a more positive role. But at the same time, when we turn to the domestic arena, it's worse than before, and both on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. So again, I apologize that I'm going back to the same issue that we've tried to tackle from a number of different angles, and I'm just adding one more angle to this. Why would we believe that what has failed, or at least that the focus of efforts that have failed, have a better chance of succeeding now?
So I love the question, because normally I'm the one who brings forth everybody's depression in analyzing the conflict, but you're asking me to suggest why we should be a little more optimistic. So I shall try. I would also digress for a moment and tell you, Shai, as I have in the past, that your book is terrific. I used it last spring, and it filled an incredibly important need in doing exactly what you just described when discussing narratives. So congratulations on that. And I hope
Thank you.
Gabby is right that you're working on the third edition to update it. Look, let me suggest 3 or 4 responses and then maybe tie them together. First of all, I almost never use the word failure with regard to previous efforts at negotiation. The reality is we haven't succeeded to reach a final agreement, but any analysis, whether by two-staters or otherwise, of the negotiations since the early 1990s would point out a tremendous amount of progress that was made in narrowing differences on territorial issues, on Jerusalem. Prime Minister Olmert in 2008 did reference the Canadian ideas for deferring sovereignty in the old city, even to an extent on refugees, discussions held at Taba that were memorialized by Moratinos, the European envoy at the time. Now, one can say, well, if you didn't reach an agreement, it failed. But this peace process has been built, in some respects, I've compared it at times to building a cathedral in the Middle Ages. It goes over a long period of time. You start with a foundation, and then somebody builds a little bit on the foundation and changes the architecture, design a little bit. And that's what we have. We have had a peace process that's building towards a resolution, which hopefully one day we can get there. So I am not persuaded that failure up until now suggests the impossibility of success maybe in the next round or the round after or the round after that. Second, I agree fully that the first thing you do in analyzing this situation is looking at the international, regional, and local contexts. I love discussing Madrid because everything came together so perfectly before Madrid on all of those levels that, in a sense, it was sui generis. Could we ever have a situation as conducive to peacemaking as existed then? And the answer is probably not. And it's even more complicated because if you look at those 3 tiers from Biden's perspective, international, regional, and local, and then you have local political. It's not just local in Israel and Palestine, but if you imagine the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, it's filled with domestic priorities, whether it's immigration, healthcare, racial relations, abortion, reproductive rights, and so forth. He inherited a mess, and just domestically, let alone foreign policy. And then he has now had to focus on these 2 incredibly important wars, while also keeping in his sights perhaps the most important strategic issue for the United States, which is China. How do you move from a potential conflict into maybe cooperation, or at least the ability to work in parallel, if not together, on some of these issues? So I don't devalue at all how challenging this is. But, presidents have a choice to make. And this leads me to my last point, which is my elevator conversation. We all imagine, you entered the lobby of a 45-story building, and there's Joe Biden about to enter the same elevator, and there's only the 2 of you. How do you spend that next 3 or 4 minutes? And I would spend those next 3 or 4 minutes the way we've spent the last hour and change, which is to say to him, look, if you don't try to resolve this underlying conflict once and for all, and I'll use the word try, all you're going to do is leave this for your successor and everybody else's successor. And, all of us in 3 years or 5 years or 7 years will see another iteration of the conflict. But this is a choice to make. You can try to be a transformational president with all of that entails. The Republicans screaming at you, the progressives applauding you, the centrists not being happy with pressure, the Israeli lobby being upset. Everybody's going to come at you, but that's the challenge of leadership. And so, you know, my elevator conversation might end with Biden by saying, I don't envy you this situation, but if there's a chance, a possibility that he will choose to do this, then I'm not pessimistic at all.
So I'll end first of all by thanking you before I send the microphone back to Gary, but also tell you and the audience how lucky we were to have you, and because we've not had you only for the 4 minutes of the elevator, but we had you for 1 hour and 15 minutes, which means we're on the lucky side. And Gary, over to you. You're on mute, you're on mute.
I hate to end this conversation. It's really been a brilliant discussion. And, you know, I come away both encouraged by the possibility, but also daunted by the challenges. I know we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but we'll make sure that the participants see them. And I hope at some point in the future, we can have Dan back for another session. I want to thank Karen Spira, our assistant director at the Crown Center, for making everything work behind the scenes. She's the one who directs us all and makes sure that that the process works. So finally, I hope that you'll join us for our next seminar, which is next Wednesday, March 13th. We have Narjas Bajagoli and Vali Nasser here to speak about their new book, How Sanctions Work and the Impact of Economic Warfare. So again, thank you all very much for joining us, and hope to see you next week. Goodbye.